Many believe that the West Coast, East Coast elites have been the creators and disseminators of neoliberal thought and practice, much to the detriment of the American worker for over a quarter of a century. Is this true? Was communism inadvertently good for American union workers, and did it lead to higher wages? Fact is, when it comes to ferreting out the Platonic truth about neoliberalism, the Soviet Union and international communism cannot be ignored. Can venture capitalists, Wall Street, financial modernizers, and IT pioneers continue to push their globalizing agenda forward? And should they be able to? Is the demise of the neoliberal order hidden by the smokescreen generated by our fiery culture wars? Has the rise of Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders pushed the neoliberal order to its breaking point? Find out on Emir Phillips' American Pragmatist.
Ignoring all of the remedies, believing all of the rumors, with their endless database. I wanna sit with my enemies and say we should have done this sooner, while I look them in the face. Maybe that will crack the case.
Freedom is money, more or less. Like individual freedom is highly correlated with my bank account. Like what's in my wallet right now, that will gain me my freedom, which I understand. I can see that.
Kind of a Philistine way of looking at it, yet that's how Wall Street looks at it. That's how a lot of Americans look at it, fortunately or unfortunately. But I'm going to concede the point. Yes, freedom, we all believe that deep down to a certain degree. Freedom is your bank account, and that's kind of sad. And, I don't quite think all over, but it's a lot of truth to what you're saying. So we'll roll with it.
Well, real quick, just because we talked about this before, but just like looking at things now, like we have a little economic situation now, like I said, I might have to change up my work a little bit because I need more money. Why do I need more money? Because I don't feel like I have that much freedom. I might get stuck in a spot. So like I just kind of think that rings true. That's all.
Yeah, we all associate debt with slavery, right? Mm-hmm. We associate debt with slavery, and that's a legitimate analogy most Americans make. So good point. A poor American worker is not free no matter how you vote. So your voting isn't as important as your bank account. And I think we kind of sense that. So you might be free in God's eyes, but in this world, you're mired to a chain of existence that Hamilton, Lincoln, and Trump don't want for Americans. They don't want that for Americans. So, other people were never that concerned. Alexander Hamilton and Lincoln didn't worry about other nations all that much, except for England. And the only reason why he worried about England was he wanted America to be preeminent, and so did Alexander Hamilton, which is why Alexander Hamilton imitated England, and he was against France. It wasn't because he was, licking England's boots. He was trying to learn from England to imitate England. We imitated the Bank of England, how they operated. We imitated a lot of things from England, their navy, their strategy, because we wanted to be number one, so we would be the most free. So other nations were never the primary concern. Lincoln didn't even want to fight the Indians. He didn't get elected to Congress once because he refused to vote for the Creek War. He was not a warmonger. Either is Trump, either is Hamilton. They don't want to fight other wars. They want to make America great. And Trump is not the first person to say that. Alexander Hamilton said America is going to be great when we're independent economically, and Lincoln said that. Lincoln didn't want to invade Canada or Mexico. They weren't about war expanding the boundaries of America. It was vertical, not horizontal, that they were focused on. Vertical, not horizontal.
So many who picture neoliberalism, they see in their minds the tentacles of the Federal Reserve, and internationally speaking, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, all of which operate largely free of democratic oversight.
From that progressive vantage point, and a lot of libertarians would agree with the progressives on what you just described, the Federal Reserve doesn't have democratic oversight, which is why Bernie Sanders, in the great financial crisis, he subpoenaed the Federal Reserve specifically because of that, because there was no democratic oversight. And Bernie Sanders essentially said, if you're going to give trillions of dollars to Wall Street, we should know where's it coming from and why, and we should put strings attached to it. And certain banks that we find are committing fraud should go down. I think a lot of Americans, even a lot of Trump Republicans, agree with that specific position by Bernie Sanders, myself included. So, from that progressive vantage point, neoliberalism is configured as the enemy of the people, and it's framed as a tool. It's used by, it's used by elites to subvert democracy and undercut movements. When really neoliberalism is the market largely unencumbered by the state. I think that's a more fair version, although the other version is not without its truth that you alluded to. But in the heart of the matter, it's the unfettered capitalism, institutionally executed. That's really it. And it's executed by a man that's erratically fallen. And why I am a capitalism and why you can't negate neoliberalism completely is how, if man is fallen, if man is not good, how do we make a purse out of a sow's ear? In our belief system, as capitalists, we take everyone's selfishness, everyone's self-interest, and everyone's fighting for themselves through the market and working through the market. We create innovative products. Nobody is putting all their products on Amazon or Walmart because they're nice saints or monks or nuns. They're putting their products on Wall Street and Amazon to make money. And while those greedy, selfish people want to make as much money as they can, it works out, or so we think, to our overall advantage. And we create more innovative, cool, wanted stuff than any society since man has walked erect. And there's no denying that. And you have to give capitalism its due, which is why, progressivism goes way too far to me in being anti-capitalist. And while neoliberalism has issues now in today's world that are serious, and Bernie Sanders found some of the holes, and so did Trump, in my opinion, we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater.
But then I would ask, I guess, in a little contradiction to that, like many libertarians would, at least in my viewpoint, would embrace neoliberalism then.
Yeah, because there's a schizophrenia with neoliberalism with the Federal Reserve because it's a hybrid institution. It's part public and part private. So They don't like the Federal Reserve and they like private money. So they're going to be generally pro cryptocurrency, pro Bitcoin. They're going to be generally pro Tea Party. Libertarians generally strongly embrace the market. They don't view the Federal Reserve as an embracing of the market. They view the Federal Reserve as an extension of the state, even though it's run privately by banks. So it's a little schizophrenia when it comes to the Federal Reserve. But if we exclude the Federal Reserve, which is a hybrid institution, libertarians generally embrace neoliberalism pretty strongly. But, with the libertarians, sometimes I want to say you're well off and you're pro-market, so you don't have to help people or the poor. Where the New Deal Democrat or FDR would tell the libertarians, who's going to help give a social safety net, So I think, libertarians, whenever they see the state at any level, the Federal Reserve, which has done a lot of good things, or the IMF and the World Bank, which is, depending on your perspective, more dicey, they tend to support the market globally, the Federal Reserve, the IMF, and the World Bank. But because they're part of the state, to a large degree, libertarians won't like them. So there's a little schizophrenia. So, the IMF and the World Bank, to be clear, support neoliberalism, but are not democratically controlled. And that's where the libertarians are kind of like, that's what leaves libertarians conflicted on the point, is that, it's not democratically controlled. So libertarians can bounce here and there, but there is a consistency to their logic. So.
All right. So then I guess by that, like, how concerned is neoliberalism to questions of economic equality and redistribution? How do they view that?
I mean, I just said, not much, efficiency, market efficiency is the focus, not social justice. They would agree with the vote because that's personal liberty, voting, but market efficiency, most libertarians, when they say liberty, they don't just mean personal liberty and the liberty to hold a gun. They also mean freedom from government intervention of all kinds. And so when you apply it to economics, by definition, it's neoliberalism, unfettered capitalism, no government or state intervention in the market at all, if you're a real hard libertarian like Milton Friedman, So not much.
So then Reagan convinced many Americans that joining his political party would unshackle the economy from regulation and make them overall better, even if some people took a hit here and there.
Yes, that's a fair assessment. And yet again, we got to contextualize, during the Cold War, I would argue it did. And also I've alluded to this now, Reagan contradicted himself. We all have contradictions in ourselves. We need to be upfront about it. Reagan also used the state. He used the neoliberal people. They're using the state in the Russian-Ukraine war, so they can be hypocritical. Dick Cheney with Halliburton used the state, to fight in Iraq and make a lot of profits for Halliburton, and that's neoliberalism was running amok. So he used the state. That's hypocritical. But anyway, Reagan also used the state. And I said specifically the Star Wars program, I think is a good case. It boosts the national economy with deficit spending, with Keynesian, by about $3 trillion. And I think it did have a Keynesian multiplier effect. I don't think they would allude to it that much, Reagan, at the time, but that's what was going on. And it probably wasn't the intent to create a Keynesian multiplier effect, but it did. And so, during the Cold War, Reagan focused on what American could uniquely offer those living under communism. Remember, we're marketing America here. We're fighting a war at many levels. The Cold War, we weren't actually fighting a physical war generally. We're fighting a war of ideas, ideology. And so we have to promote individual freedom, in a wealth-driven socioeconomic sense. Why? Because that's what wasn't happening in the Soviet Empire. Your average communist in the Soviet Empire was not wealthy in a socioeconomic sense. And they were dripping with envy at American wealth, and the Soviets just couldn't counter that. So Reagan served it up to them on a platter, and it helped bring the wall down voluntarily by the Soviets. Why? Because the communists wanted to be like us. That's political order of the highest order. I started this whole podcast by talking political orders when your oppositional party institutionally is doing what you want, consciously or otherwise. My God, Reagan pulled off the political order of all time. He had the communists doing neoliberalism and tearing down the wall themselves in 1991. That may be the greatest feat of a political order in human history. He defeated the Soviet Empire essentially without firing a shot. I mean, that's just stunning.
So then this whole thing here, it's no longer, I guess, it's no longer true, or it's no longer an issue in any regard, or is this still going on?
No. I mean, if you believe China's communists, and I guess we can have a debate on whether it is or it isn't, but for Reagan, the war would still be on in terms of China, not Russia. Reagan wasn't about hating or fighting people. He was fighting an ideology. And if the Russians set down communism, he sets down the missiles. We have to be clear about that, which gives a whole new context to the Russian-Ukraine war, since Russia is absolutely not communist anymore. The Communist Party in Russia secures about maybe 10% of the vote. So the Communist Party is comatose in Russia and has been for 30 years. So in terms of communist China, I would argue, Levi, it's still true. Now, to be fair, we never economically competed head-to-head with the Soviet Union. The Iron Curtain prevented that. They didn't let us in to the extent they could block us out. They did. We had some secret agreements, oil and gas, but generally we didn't trade too much unless they stole our stuff. So now it's different. We do socioeconomically compete with and in China. So Trump's fair trade is much more relevant than Wall Street's free trade. So we have a weird situation going here. And the issue here that Reagan absolutely never had to deal with, because he didn't interact socioeconomically with the wall. The Soviet Empire was closed to us by and large. Here we have communist China, and we're outsourcing American jobs to communist Chinese slave labor, and looking the other way when stolen American tech is used to lower costs and raise profits, and therefore Wall Street stock prices, which help everyone's retirement in the form of 401k plan. So, but I don't believe for 1 second Ronald Reagan would have been okay with the denigration of the American workers. And as I said, the $2,000 per car tariff on Toyota cars proves that. So I don't think Reagan in his mind could have reasoned to allow our tech to be stolen for 25 years since China got admitted to the World Trade Organization, 2001, but started in 1998 with Clinton. I don't think for a second, for sure, he would have kicked them out of the World Trade Organization for what they've done, not to mention COVID. I believe Reagan would have kicked them out of the World Trade Organization for a few reasons. So stealing the tech, slave labor, and outsourcing, he's going to cut that off, COVID, you name it.
Given all that, I'm very intrigued by this idea of libertarianism. And so I wanted to kind of come back to the topic of freedom specifically.
Well, given your views, which could be kooky to me, what do you mean by libertarianism? You tell me, and we go from there.
I'll go from like freedom, because I know libertarianism is in a very broad sense, like no government interference, leave us alone, let us exist, but I guess freedom specifically, freedom from, I guess, the past you're referring to. I recall that early cybernetics movements that inspired the likes of, like Stuart Brand and Steve Jobs to associate the creation of the personal computer with the quest for individual freedom, and like how Ralph Nader and his political allies freed, the consumer from repressive corporate and government elites. But like, people had more choices, practically speaking, in their everyday minds and everyday lives. Is kind of how I view, I guess, freedom and libertarianism in a relative nutshell.
Given what you said, I would say freedom within the context of neoliberalism is a bit different.
Tell me how.
It's more in terms of freeing the individual and their awareness, their consciousness from the grip of large, stultifying state institutions, privileging market disruption and innovation over a state-regulated economic order, celebrating globalization, or another word they used to use more often, cosmopolitanism, multiculturalism. You see that a lot now. That's getting pushed in higher ed all the way down. Multiculturalism is a component, a subset of cosmopolitanism and globalization. Over what they would say is a market crimping nationalism. The market's going to be crimped in a nationalistic context as opposed to a global one. So bigger is better. Bigger markets are always more efficient under neoliberalism. Therefore, why not have the globe if we can get it?
So then, like, what are the international roots of neoliberalism then?
And they do have international roots. So post-World War I Vienna, because that's the home of the neoliberalist economist Friedrich Hayek, who Reagan admittedly did read a lot of, and is a very respected economist. So, and Ludwig von Mises, this is the Austrian school of economics, it's called, and the libertarians usually, these are their two heroes, Hayek and Mises, Ludwig von Mises. So in a war between World War I and World War II, Geneva also emerged as a think tank. We talked about think tanks being critical for political orders. Here you go. Here's one, the neoliberal ideas at Mount Pelerin. Mount Pelerin is in Switzerland. It was a think tank generally viewed as a place where Hayek and others attempted to turn neoliberalism into a disciplined thought collective. I mean, Mount Pelerin is huge for the think tanks. By the 90s, neoliberalism is also called the Washington Consensus. When I'm teaching economics, I will teach the students that instead of saying neoliberalism, magazines or newspapers will also say the Washington Consensus. So that structured a lot of the world economically after the Soviet Empire fell, and I would say most of the world globally.
One thing you talk about a lot, it's the Soviet Empire, the Soviet Union, and like the whole history of that. Obviously, you have close ties to it. So I guess, like, just how critical was the actual fall of the Soviet Union? So, like,
I mean, you got to be kidding me. I don't know of an international event in the century that matched the Russian Revolution of 1917 in importance. You're going to be hard pressed. In the 50 years after their rise to power in Russia, communists, they walled off, as we've already talked about, huge parts of the world, Soviet Union, then half of Europe, then China. They were in effect economically set apart from capitalist economics, which is why Reagan focused his attack on free trade. Fair trade was not yet an issue. So people make all kinds of assumptions about Reagan that just don't apply. He never had to socioeconomically confront, interact with, or trade with the Soviet bloc because it was walled off, and that's not the case now.
Wait, so would you say that like fair trade was not an issue until communist China was admitted into the WTO, the World Trade Organization? So I think that would be like between 98 and 2000, 2001-ish.
For me, yes. For Ross Perot in 94, he would have said NAFTA in the mid-90s. So during Clinton, but between Bush and Clinton, for Ross Perot, 93, 94, our trade with Canada and Mexico, to me, even though we trade a lot with them, it's not that unfair. They're not stealing our stuff. It wouldn't have triggered me, but I think a lot of the Trump Republicans would have been, it's China. It's China, because that's at a whole different level. So yes, to answer your question, 98 to 2001, fair trade becomes a big issue. But for Ross Perot, it's 93, 94, 92. I would say, throughout the podcast, for the first third of the Cold War, we got to look back. Communism was a serious threat in Western Europe, and I don't mean to it, I mean in it. A lot of Western Europe almost fell to communism. Italy, 48, France. So for the first 2/3 of the Cold War, there was a similar threat across the whole world. Africa, Asia, I can't even go into all the areas the communists were fighting in Africa and Asia in the 70s and 80s. We'd be here all day. So, at the end of the day, say, for example, fascism and Nazism can be understood as the radical right, and they were responses to communism's rise. You don't have to agree, you can hate it, whatever. There's a reason it came up. It didn't come out from nowhere. I'm just trying to show you the significance of communism and how pervasive it was. I don't think I hit that hard enough. So, in the United States from 1920s onward, communism was regarded by many, not all, as a mortal threat to the American way of life, especially within the Republican Party, not so much in the Democratic Party, but it started in the 1920s here.
But the Great Depression, which that ushered in FDR's New Deal, the Second World War, both moderated America's anti-communism with a much bigger federal government.
Yeah, which is why that's why even Eisenhower executed the highway system, which we alluded to. And by the way, the highway system also facilitated our missile system, which I think was also a motive of his, because the missiles could move easier in the West if we had a highway system. So he's killing two birds for one, which is smart. And, no other single political force in the 20th century had near a comparable influence on the world or American politics, for that matter, than the specter of international communism, which I really want the viewer to get, because your generation really misses this. And you can't understand Reagan, Thatcher, or Pope John Paul, who fought tooth, nail, and claw against it. You can't understand it until you understand the specter, the full socioeconomic spectrum of international communism in that century.
Pope John Paul, no, we miss him. I miss him. Regardless, I would say, it seems today the power of, and I guess the fear unleashed by the communist threat is now, it seems like it's largely forgotten, especially lost on my generation and younger. It's just not, we had to talk about before how there's a lot of people my age who often jokingly or in some regards seriously kind of say profess the beauty of communism, Communist Manifesto, not just social, not just what's it called, social democracy. They say communist. I am communist. I lean towards a communist sort of way, viewpoint, that sort of thing. And I think it's because this is largely lost on them.
Yeah, I hear the term using now, it gives me a heart attack. I'm like, why did we fight? Why did Reagan fight and win the Cold War? It's glibly thrown around, frankly, by a lot of progressives, and they really need to study their history to know what they're talking about. No ideology murdered more people than international communism. But neoliberalism has to be viewed in the light of the Soviet Union between 89 and 91 when it collapsed. And so in that moment, capitalism's chief global antagonist disappeared abruptly, systemically, and pretty completely. The consequences of the Soviet Empire's fall, as well as, and this is critical, because this is not trivia generated, the simultaneous defeat of its legitimating ideology, which has come back, in my opinion, to a certain degree in the progressives. It was incredibly immense. People could no longer with a straight face argue communism in the late 80s and early 90s. It was done not just economically, socioeconomically, but ideologically, philosophically, politically done. And, that's what made that vacuum. And it wasn't just a vacuum economically, it was a vacuum at every single level of reality. And your generation has to understand that. That's what made possible neoliberalism and American neoliberalism, to be specific, global triumph from 1989 to 2008. America, ideologically, socioeconomically, through the dollar, politically, financially, ran rampant over the rest of the world, for good or bad, from 1989 to 2008 with no constraints, none, because the collapse of the Soviet Union was absolute, sudden, and cataclysmic.
Yes, one huge consequence, obviously, of communism's fall, it opened a large part of the world, essentially, Russia and Eastern Europe, to capitalist penetration, because before, as you mentioned before, with the Iron Curtain and everything, that just wasn't possible. But when it
With
fell,
no counterbalance, no counterbalance ideologically, no alternative reality, no argument, no regulation, no international body to say, hey, you're going too far, this is too much, which can be a problem. Sometimes winning completely can make a complete mess of things sometimes. And it also dramatically widened the willingness of China. China switched after Tiananmen Square. Switched, maybe not. They moderated their communism. I believe China is still ultimately a communist state with the Politburo and their planning, but they obviously morphed, changed, become more of a hybrid after Tiananmen Square. So even communist China had to seriously and institutionally experiment with key aspects of capitalist economics. So it was unbelievable.
But then I guess, Reagan's dream ultimately came true. Capitalism became, global in the 1990s in a way it had not been, since prior to the First World War. He got what he wanted.
Yeah, it's true. The globalized world that dominated international affairs in the 90s and 2000s, unimaginable, as I've said, apart from international communism's collapse. And another key consequence of communism's fall may be less obvious, but it's of huge socioeconomic importance. And it is this. It removed what had been an imperative in America and in Europe and elsewhere, which you just alluded to, for socioeconomic class compromise between capitalist elites, owners of capitalists, Wall Street, the wealthy, the owners, and the working class, between corporate management and workers. In a word, unionization. In other words, so long as communism was around, America allowed unionization. The Taft-Hartley Act, 1947, allowed the legalization of unionization in America. Would it have happened if Soviet communism hadn't been around? Would we have allowed workers to unionize in 1947, even with a Democratic president, Truman, even with the New Deal order, even with the Democratic Party having a political order? Would we have allowed it? We fought it for 20 years, tooth, nail, and claw. Mafia fought with the workers in the street, shooting each other, with the cops fighting with the owners. They shot each other in the hills of West Virginia. Would we allow unionization without the counterweight of international communism? Well, this is huge, huge.
But then what triggered and maintained this compromise, between corporate management, and unionizing labor?
From the 1930s through the 60s, international communism was understood through the lens of totalitarianism. The state was pervasive, complete. It was regarded as a total system of rule that, once established, could never be overthrown. Once a country went communist, that was it. It took over that country forever. I'm Cuban American, so I look at Cuba. They're still there. So that was the view. Now, in the end, it turned out to be not quite true, because communism fell, except ironically in Cuba. But that was the view then. It couldn't be overthrown once there. So a nation lost to communism would never be regained for the capitalist world. It was like getting bit by a zombie. Once done, you're done, which is why we didn't want communism extended to a country. Truman said, this is it. You're not going any farther. And we fought in Korea and Vietnam on that basis, with that mindset.
So I guess, as you put it, the specter, this ghost of the communists, advance. It required from the United States a policy of military containment unprecedented in our history.
Yeah, I referred to Truman, the Truman Doctrine, which said that, but it actually comes from America. One of our greatest statesmen in our history is George Kennan. George Kennan policy of containment, but it also impelled capitalist elites in advanced industrial countries, including the U.S., America, to compromise with unions and labor in ways I don't think for a second they would have done otherwise. The fear of communism made possible the class compromise between capital and labor that underwrote the New Deal order. This is critical to understand. To understand the last century and this one, you must understand what I just said. It also made possible similar class compromises in many social democracies in Europe after the Second World War. So workers were paid a fair wage, because if you didn't pay them a fair wage, they'd go communist. That was the fear anyway.
So, fearing communist takeover of unions, labor had to be appeased by corporate management with higher wages, like you just said. You don't want people joining the enemy. They don't want shifting over to a different world order, because your world order, your economic order doesn't give them what they're looking for.
Yeah, and to be clear, the Communist Party was working through the unions. That we know for a
Yeah.
fact after we got access to, secret information from from Russia in the 90s. We know there were tons of communist spies and KGB agents in our union. So this fear turned out to be absolutely correct and legitimate. But at the end of the day, at the end of the American worker, after World War II, the right to unionize could not be overly curtailed or sabotaged, unlike before World War II. Not to mention the fact you had 3 million Americans who were trained how to use a rifle. And if you mess with a man's work and ability to provide for his family, you probably want to let American workers unionize rather than have the police deal with 3 million angry American workers who know how to use a bazooka and a machine gun. You probably want to compromise. So that didn't hurt either, that a large, significant part of the male population of the United States was now military trained, and they were coming back in 1946 by the millions. So I think it's no fluke that we allowed unionization 1 year later. I think that also was involved at institutional level. But nonetheless, this all worked to the advantage of the American worker, which was awesome. And that forced a sense of fair play between corporate management and labor that is no longer in effect with the demise of international communism. Ironically, the evil empire had this unintended policy effect that helped the American worker attain the American dream, ironically.
And now corporate management can outsource labor globally? Is that like
that's what drives Trump crazy? Yeah. Soon enough, they might very well outsource themselves as Chinese companies acquire greater corporate management skills. They won't need them. Wall Street, that'll be kind of hilarious. As the Chinese communists get greater capitalistic acumen and put their own effective spin on stolen American tech. So it would be kind of karmic justice of the highest order if the Chinese got rid of Wall Street and created their own Wall Street and put Wall Street out of business. Talk about karmic justice. So there might be a comedy at the end of this, after all, a tragic comedy, but comedy nonetheless.
It'd be funny for a second.
Yeah, yeah.
Funny for a hard second.
Yeah.
But I guess the collapse of communism then. So like this cleared the world of capitalism's most ardent opponent, the biggest opponent for many, many years. Vast new territories and peoples can now be bought into a single capitalist labor and retail consumer market at this point. Then once it falls,
in other words, what you just said, single capitalist labor consumer market, globalization, and its attendant multiculturalism all go hand in hand here, hand in hand. You psychologically and mentally, you can't miss this to understand the world around you. This is the economic philosophy that runs the world, which you just said, and they use different terms of art: globalization, multiculturalism, retail consumer market, single capitalist market, cosmopolitanism, blah, 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 blah. Get to the point. It's a net. It's neoliberalism.
Well, certain things just ring better in other people's ears, Emir.
Right.
That business, that's what you do.
Marketing.
Yeah, marketing. But alarmingly, I would say, the class compromise that had formed the basis of the New Deal order, can now be jettisoned.
And that's right, and that's critical. Why? There was no longer a hard left to fear. There was no longer the Red Scare that was actually working to American workers' benefit. The American worker didn't realize it, although Ross Perot screamed it and almost became president from that quote he made, which is oh so famous. Look it up on the internet. That great sucking sound he warned us about prophetically. He was a little John the Baptist screaming in the wilderness. No one listened to him, but he was right. The American worker would not wake up until Ross Perot had a political son, and his name is Donald Trump.
I would also say that like Bernie Sanders, taps into that same sort of base, though.
I mean, yeah, okay, fair comeback. Bernie, more in the past than lately, in my opinion, but we won't split hairs. Bernie Sanders represents the hard left that corporate management and Wall Street fear immensely, and rightfully so. And they still fear him, which is, that's why I said earlier, he's the only person Wall Street hates more than President Trump, and it's Bernie Sanders. And like I said, you see that in the amount of votes or lack of that Bernie got, the least, and Trump second least. And just look at the vote count in Manhattan and all the elections, where they were on the ticket. They did horrible, where Hillary Clinton and Biden, whoever Wall Street's in love with, Romney or Obama, they get the votes. Wall Street's not stupid.
Yeah, Wall Street prefers Trump to Sanders, but just kind of like as the lesser of two evils, more or less.
Yeah, by an inch, by a nose, since Trump's a populist, and a populist is a capitalist who wants fairness. He's not a communist, not hard left socialist, not. So fairness, fair trade, that's the art of the deal for Donald Trump. Whereas Sanders is dyed-in-the-wool Marxist. He was in the Soviet Empire during the 80s. You can look it up on YouTube. It's real simple. It's him. He's in the Soviet, he's in Russia, honeymooning. He was in a kibbutz in Israel. I mean, he's got a Marxist background. Although he did defend the right to own guns when he was running for Vermont senator. So ironically, Bernie Sanders has a strong track record of protecting gun ownership, which he shies away from recently. But when he was representing Vermont, the rural state, they're pro-gun. So, but he goes with the term social democrat because America don't want to hear Marxist words. But to be very clear, Sanders, if able, would nationalize nearly all major industries. I don't think I've ever heard of Sanders coming up with a private sector solution, a market solution to anything. And I mean anything. And I dare anyone to see, I could be wrong, but I dare any of our listeners or viewers to find a market solution that Bernie Sanders came up with. Whereas Trump's first move is always to see if the market can fix the problem. And if not, like COVID, then he'll jump. The government should come in and, maintain economic growth. But he'll frack first. And if that don't work, like during COVID, he'll do that. So you saw that in response to COVID. So he can go either way, but market first, and then he'll use Uncle Sam, just like Lincoln and Hamilton. It's that same American system economically.
All right, then. So, real quick, let's rewind just a little bit. The 90s, politically speaking, was marked by the Clinton administration and those sorts of policies. A Democrat, more or less. How does that fit with neoliberalism?
President Clinton, his role in securing neoliberalism's triumphs, I would say it was more important than Reagan. After 1991, the allure or the basis for capitalist elites or owners and supporters to compromise with the American working class was gone. There was no counterweight. Reagan had to deal with a massive counterweight. And President Clinton not only abandoned the working class in favor of communist China by essentially letting them into the World Trade Organization, and that was key. That was the biggest neoliberalism win, and Clinton did it, and President Bush went with it too. And a lot of Republicans voted for it with Clinton, and we had the uniparty there. Okay, a big part of the Republican Party will right there vote with Clinton, so they're not innocent. If you're upset by this, if you're not, then you're happy about it. But to be clear, I just want to reiterate the Republicans, to a large extent, not completely. You had Ross Perot, you had libertarians, and you had some precursor to the Trump Republicans, fighting, but they were with Clinton in letting China in the World Trade Organization.
All right, then. So I guess that explains why the Chinese also seem to be in the White House until China was admitted into the World Trade Organization. They lived
in the White House. They were in the White House every day. If you go back and look at the news media, you had the Chinese in Clinton's White House. People thought China was running the government. It was ridiculous. I mean, there's no doubt in my mind, there's a correlation between the amount and number of Chinese officials in the White House and them being let in the World Trade Organization with no conditions. There should have been conditions. Don't steal our tech, and we want proof you're not stealing our tech. And you got to compete fairly with American workers. You have to pay your workers a minimum wage and products we compete with. You can't use slave labor. If Clinton would have done that, I think we'd have a whole different world right now, So, but, it wasn't just Clinton, though. Both parties were behind it. Except for Ross Perot, who was basically the Trump of the 90s. So, and China technically entered the World Trade Organization December 11, 2001, but it was under Clinton administration the deal was struck. He struck the deal, and Bush rolled with it. So, and that was a big mistake.
Yeah. So then, the fall of communism, in short, forms a central part of neoliberalism's triumph, in the end.
Ironically, isn't that hilarious? Dark comedy. Absolutely. American labor was strongest when the threat of communism was greatest. I gotta say that again. American labor was strongest when the threat of communism was greatest, because the corporate management viewed American labor as the lesser of two evils. Better to give the American worker a fair wage than they go communist and kill me, eat me for dinner. There's always better than that. Better to part with your money than your life. So, but with that threat gone, American labor and unions were in big trouble, and Ross Perot was the only person I'm aware of who articulated that at a national level in the 90s.
There's this. Oh, yeah. Finish your thought. Sorry.
Well, he was prophetic about it. He was prophetic, to be fair, a lot of Americans intuitively listened to him. If you look at the vote count, had he not jumped out of the election and come back because he thought the CIA was harassing him, and maybe they were, maybe they weren't, who knows? But if he hadn't opted out of the election and stayed in it, I think he probably would have won. He probably would have been president, which would have been very interesting.
Sadly, it was not a reality. But I will say there's this real irony here that the New Deal was primarily allowed, like, I guess in your mind, due to America compromising with American labor not to go communist or socialist.
Yeah, I think that's well said. Yeah.
So then when we won the Cold War, what, the unions were just done? Like, pretty
much. I mean, you look at the unionization of American workers, and it's been plummeting since, the 80s, but in the 90s, it's a spiral. I mean, right to work states, the process started under Reagan, and admittedly, some unions, they were bloated, unaccountable, inefficient institutions, legacy of Keynesian economics that went a little too far. I concede that point. And so they did need some serious market corrections and accountability. You did need to fire incompetent and bad workers, But I don't believe Reagan would have included in those market corrections, included in that reformation at institutional level of unions, outsourcing damn near the entire manufacturing base of America to communist China. Reagan, as a neoliberal, would never have outsourced the manufacturing base of the Rust Belt to communist China, since they used slave labor to compete against American free labor. And Reagan would not have been in to include allowed communist China to steal so much of our tech. Reagan would have viewed that as an act of war and responded accordingly.
Yeah, kind of like President Trump was kind of getting that. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So then, like, dismantling of the welfare state and the labor movement marched in tandem with communism's collapse then.
No doubt about it. And there's no doubt about it. The very real communist threat from the 30s to the 60s, it facilitated the class compromise between capital and labor that sustained the New Deal order, that political order. The disappearance of that threat, the communist international communism between 1989 and 1991, when it fell, facilitated the end of that compromise and the global triumph of the neoliberal order that we have today, although it's fractured by Trump and Sanders.
So then we really can't understand neoliberalism and the political order it still somewhat sustains without fully, keeping in mind the broader context, I should say, of the epic 5-year global struggle between capitalism and international communism. That's kind of like
yes. And that's the problem I have with your generation. You don't read history books, you don't understand communism. You're too busy watching, Amazon, Netflix, and this is why I can't have a conversation with you or your generation. Yes. That's exactly.
And also just to kind of throw this out there as well, because we talked about it a little bit before, but like I do think, with like a lot of my peers, kind of leaning more communist, or at least labeling themselves as communist or social democratic, whatever you want to call it. I do think there's just it definitely comes from a sort of young American hubris of like, yes, there's these communist things that happened in the past that were extremely bad. I do think there's a lot of people who are aware of that, but there is a hubris like we can do it better because we're Americans, because we're more advanced, we have better morals than our predecessors and stuff like that. But obviously,
every state thought they could improve on communism. Every state thought that.
I'm aware. I'm very aware here. I'm very aware of that. But I do think that's a shortcoming view of a lot of people my ages. I'm not saying socialist views can't like, and socialist policies, as you've already stated, within the rules of capitalism, can't offer a lot of help. But it's just that I think that a lot of people nowadays, because of everything we just discussed, they feel compelled to like throw themselves into something they don't fully understand, or label themselves as something they don't fully understand. But all that aside, I just felt like I had to say that.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair.
Yeah, I think that every political order contains ideological contradictions, as you mentioned before, and conflicts among constituencies, and that it must manage, at some point, correct? Like everything has to. Yeah,
that's absolutely correct. And the neoliberal order is not an exception. It's got to manage its conflicts too, its contradictions as well.
Yes, obviously. So one such contradiction has already been noted. That which existed between those who saw neoliberalism as a strategy for enhancing rule by elites, Wall Street making tons of money, versus those who saw it more as a pathway towards personal emancipation personal freedom from the totalitarian state, the Soviet Union. Are there more internal contradictions in those two, just because those are two big ones, but I feel like there's something more, potentially more underneath that?
Yeah, because you've alluded to the first one's kind of Wall Street-ish to generalize, and the second one's more libertarian, freedom to do what I want to do with no government interference. So there, and that didn't get fleshed out during Reagan, but it's getting more fleshed out in our day and age now. But yeah, other internal contradictions. Well, you just hit a huge one. That was a huge one. But I'd say another lay in the uneasy coexistence within the neoliberal order of two strikingly different moral perspectives on how to achieve the good life. Because remember the vision we talked about in the podcast, the good life. What is the good life? How do you get it? What's your vision of the good life? And that's important. That goes to the heart of the political order. So, I'd say one vision within the neoliberal celebrates self-reliance, strong families, disciplined attitudes towards work, sexuality, and consumption. And that moral perspective, argues those values are necessary to protect individuals against market excesses, because the market's not moral. The market will give you whatever you want. And it takes the aforementioned values I just alluded to use the market effectively, wholesomely, and morally. So it's a counterweight to the market, the values I just said. So that's one perspective.
So what do you mean by market excesses, though? Like, what exactly is that?
I talked about consumption, for example, and this is a big issue at our times right now, Levi, with the debt. By accumulating debt, by purchasing more than you can afford, and or indulging in addictive appetites for sex, drugs, fentanyl, Oxycontin. I mean, the drugs in our society are crazy. Alcohol, pot, other whims that the free market, they can be construed as sanctioning. If it's in the market, it must be okay. Sanctioning carte blanche. I mean, the market's efficient whether you're talking about pot, fentanyl, sex, drugs. If the law allows it, the market will have a market for everything. If you can afford it, and you can afford the rehab, if you can afford the rehab, you're good to go, which is why our Hollywood imbibes in the market, because it can afford to pay for any of its, screw ups. So, and they're not held accountable anyway. So this is what I'm talking about by market excesses. The market is amoral, and there's a market for anything unless there's a law against it, generally.
So why would these moral constraints need to be, I guess, internalized under the neoliberal world order? Like, why?
I'd say neoliberalism frowns upon, government regulation of private behavior. So they don't want an official law against, say, pot, for example. Some other institution had to provide regulation of private behavior. So society has to be prepared for the rigors of free market life. You can buy as much fentanyl as you want. Why not? The market will have it. I mean, in America, anything goes if you can afford it. Neoliberalism's justification is the market, unfettered capitalism. Well, the key to unfettered capitalism is money, if you can afford it. We said earlier in this podcast, the key to freedom is how much you have in your bank account. Well, let's just say you have an infinite bank account. Well, in the market, in a free market, not with any state intervention, imagine a market with no state intervention. You want to buy kids for sex. You want to do any kind of drug you want. It will provide a market for organs. You want a kidney, you can buy one from whomever, doesn't matter. It'll be on the marketplace and you buy it. There's no questions asked, so long as, and this is the only criteria, you can afford it. So that's market excess.
Yeah, and the rehab you alluded to earlier, I guess, is this then a social economic foundation for the moral majority?
Yeah, because the moral majority's view is what keeps America strong is if we're morally strong, we can use unfettered capitalism and not succumb to its vices if we have the values I alluded to, which many people would probably call the moral majority. So, so I don't think it's just the moral majority. You could also say if you were strong Catholic, Christian, I mean, whatever, Muslim, Jewish, a person of faith, usually prudent, somebody who, thinks you shouldn't spend too much. Some people think it's immoral to go in debt. A lot of people, for whatever reason, they think, it's not a good thing to go in debt. So, but that would be one foundation of the neoliberal order, but there would be others. So, and I've just rattled off a few. There has to be a counterweight to neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is unfettered capitalism. If you have unfettered capitalism and it's just a matter of buying whatever you want on the market, how does society maintain itself? It has to have certain values, I would think.
So does neoliberalism support other societal movements which are contradictory to this?
Yeah, we've alluded to it. We
Yeah,
talked about
yeah,
cosmopolitan, globalist. You or me or both of us have used the word multicultural. So the other moral perspective within neoliberalism, encouraged, institutionally encouraged now by the neoliberal order, that's critical, is cosmopolitan, a borderless world where market freedoms and opportunity to fashion yourself or identity, self or identity is completely free of tradition, inheritance, or prescribed social roles. Utter, complete, unfettered freedom as long as you have the money. You can have a sex change operation so long as you have the money. You can go against any tradition you want because the government's not going to interfere. Your inheritance, you don't like your nose, you don't like your eyes, you can change it, get new ones, hair, bones, whatever. You don't like your societal role, you can change that too, assuming you can afford it. Assuming you can afford it. Multiculturalism and globalization is based on, can you afford it? Which of course is never said so clearly or cleanly.
Yeah, as you've already kind of said it, but yeah, like I presume that would encompass, BLM, feminism, diversity, multiculturalism, as we already mentioned, gay pride. Pick your.
All those could flourish in a neoliberal order.
Yeah.
All that could flourish in a neoliberal order, and many more. And a lot of what Trump would call the Rhino Republicans have no problem with that. Mitch Romney and McConnell, they don't have a problem with any of the stuff we just mentioned. Other Republicans would. So, but those are the Republicans that tend not to be with the neoliberal order. So Wall Street could care less about anything we just mentioned. What does Wall Street care about? Can you afford it? Case closed. Case closed. If you can afford it, you might as well be God. You can do anything that can be done. Anything that can be done within the market, if you can afford it.
Anything can be done with your wallet.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So cosmopolitanism, I guess is deeply egalitarian and pluralistic, I guess, by
egalitarian in the sense that everyone has access to the market. I mean, it's egalitarian in the sense we can buy a lot of stuff on Amazon or Walmart. We have the opportunity to buy it, but you can't get it if you can't afford it. It's pluralistic in that no holds barred. Anything the market can throw up, you can have access to if you can afford it. If you can afford it. You can do anything you want in America within a neoliberal order. It doesn't have to be America, but anywhere neoliberalism exists institutionally, if you can afford it. So, I would say what you just described is postmodernism institutionalized globally. Michel Foucault would be so happy. Michel Foucault was, it was a philosopher who did that. It embraces globalization and the free movement of people and the transnational links that the neoliberal order made possible. And the neoliberal order did help in winning World War III, the Cold War. It gave value, the good that would come from diverse peoples meeting each other, which is a good thing, sharing their cultures and opening new and hybrid ways of living, which can be good. But the key here is, even if it's not good, that's irrelevant. The market's amoral. The market's neutral. The market only recognizes price. In unfettered capitalism with no state intervention, if you really think about it, everything is only cordoned off or limited or circumscribed by price, meaning can you pay for it?
Yeah, I could easily see why, especially a lot of people my age would probably think yeah, this is a good thing, like the open borders sounds great, multiculturalism sounds great, people from different places come together, happily borrowing each other's work, creating this sort of unity thing. Like on face value, it seems awesome. It would be most celebrated, characterized by cities, I think, like London, Paris, New York, Hong Kong, San Francisco, Miami,
global
places
city.
like this. Yeah.
Polyglot cities.
It looks really great like that. And now the existence of such two different moral perspectives, a strength or a weakness for the. It's not for that neoliberal order. It now kind of comes in those two flavors, I think.
Yeah. And so there's an internal contradiction. I mean, we've just given two different viewpoints within the neoliberal order and the philosophical basis of why they exist. And that's a tension. So, but the strength, the socioeconomic or societal strength of neoliberalism, it's its ability to institutionally, socioeconomically, culturally, philosophically, analytically, accommodate what we just said within a common program of political economy. Very different constituencies you just described with radically divergent perspectives on the moral life and then come and both can live and breathe within the neoliberal order. That's powerful. Now, a critical key weakness is in the fact that the cultural battles between these two constituencies, I think they are now starting to erode the hegemony of neoliberal economic principles. The two different perspectives we just described are now being delineated between, say, woke BLM, progressive liberals, and Trump, evangelical, Christian, more rural Republicans. The battle lines are being drawn. The contradictions are being separated institutionally. This is another fracture in neoliberalism.
Yeah, I can see how like that sort of cosmopolitan view would attack the traditionalists for discriminating against, gays, feminists, and illegal immigrants. I can see where that tension now comes in, how that tension then, creates that crack we're talking about here.
Yeah. And the more rural, people and workers would likely attack the cosmopolitans for tolerating virtually any lifestyle, for excusing what they consider deplorable behaviors and exercise and the toleration of differences, is how the other side would view it, for showing a higher regard for foreign cultures than for America's own, while living and feeding off, they would say, America's massive bounty, feeling they were quite hypocritical to do so. And you see that in our culture wars now. So you see this fracture growing, not shrinking right now. So that's another alarm bell for neoliberalism.
Yeah, so it all comes down to culture wars.
Well, this is why we're starting to have culture wars. We didn't quite have them in the 70s and even 80s so much when we're fighting communism. We're more unified culturally. So, the reality of this polarization, it certainly contributes to the fracturing of the neoliberal order. So these culture wars, it shouldn't be allowed to obscure the coexistence of the cultural polarization. There's still a broad agreement on principles of political economy. We're not fighting yet. But my point here is, at the end of the day, neither group wants government interference, and that's neoliberal. So there's still something connecting them. Nobody wants the government to decide the battle. Nobody wants the government to come in and ref between these two perspectives we discussed. Yet, when they do, that will be a whole nother level of fracture. Until that time, neoliberalism is still powerful within this contradiction.
So does anyone embody this dynamic that, like, you can think of? You've mentioned people before.
Yeah. Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich in the 90s. We referred to that earlier. I think they did embody this. This side. Newt was the more moral majority. He literally used to say that, moral majority. And Bill Clinton, the progressive view you just described, the sex scandals. I mean, he embodied one point of view and Newt Gingrich the other, and yet they did effectuate a lot of law and compromise behind the scenes. So yeah, in the media, they were depicted themselves as opposites, like we've described these views, Levi, and sworn to kill each other, basically.
Yeah.
Clinton offered himself as welcoming racial minorities, feminists, and gays, don't tell in the army, military. Clinton was thought, he embodied the spirit of the 60s. Clinton's favorite president was JFK, and he let everybody know it. Free-spirited, character of the new left. Gingrich represented, he's a guardian of the old, the truer American, he would say, one grounded in faith, patriotism, respect for law and order, police, family values, et cetera, et cetera. But both men drew immense prestige, and both men got major electoral victories, both. 92, Clinton became the first Democrat in 16 years to win the White House. In 96, he became the first Democrat since Roosevelt to win re-election. People forget that. In 94, Newt Gingrich became Speaker of the House when he masterminded the Republicans' first sweep of both houses of Congress since 1952. So I'm giving you an example. Both guys effectuated institutionally and legally, Clinton letting China the World Trade Organization, which Newt Gingrich was for. They effectuated neoliberalism globally more than anyone else in a lot of ways. And yet they were polar opposites, because neoliberalism's political order connected them. They fought, but they weren't really at war yet. They would come together when it really mattered.
Yeah, if memory serves me, I believe that Gingrich, pledged himself and his party to obstructing Clinton, at every turn. I was a bit young, but I am a student of history in a sense, and I do remember that.
Well, tried to impeach him with Lewinsky, with the sex scandal, and he almost succeeded in really getting rid of Clinton. But, Clinton viewed Gingrich as, an unscrupulous leader of a right-wing conspiracy nut that was only existed to undermine his presidency. So they both had legitimate reasons for not liking each other, and yet promulgated neoliberalism, China, World Trade Organization, welfare reform, etc. Workers' rights and unionization went down under Clinton. Neoliberalism won, despite their feelings to each other.
So I guess like where's the commonality? Like where like you say like they could come together and they could find that common ground and everything. Where does that come in?
Well, despite the hatred for each other, they made a point of exhibiting these two power brokers. They worked together on legislation that shaped America's political order, political economy for a generation. I mean, we are still dealing with China and the World Trade Organization. The behind the scenes collaboration made possible the global triumph of the neoliberal order. Another one right up there with China would be they took down the Glass-Steagall Act, the barrier between commercial banking and more traditional mortgage banking, allowing banking to become a whole level more speculative when they combined forces to get rid of the Glass-Steagall Act, without which there would have been no great financial crisis. So the deregulation of global capital markets came back from the getting along legislatively of Gingrich's Republicans and Clinton's New Left Democrats to free banking and unregulate Wall Street completely, which unintendedly led to the great financial crisis when Wall Street wasn't regulated at all and came up with the security-backed mortgages. So,
all right, then I know I'm bouncing about a bit here. I'm just like a lot of thoughts spinning. Like I believe before you mentioned Frederick Hayek, in terms of neoliberalism.